it's Markus, and we're recording today the 113th episode of the Space Cafe podcast, and this is the recording of the intro. Let's go. Hello, everyone. This is the Space Cafe podcast, and I'm Markus. So there is no planet B, they say. Or is there? I'm fully aware of what I'm saying and what that saying is meant to mean. That we can't run from our problems. We should fix our problems here on Earth before we even dare to think about venturing into the unknown toward becoming an interplanetary species. But what if, just for a second, what if our cultural and technological evolution has accelerated beyond our ability to address those issues in real time? We're just a click away from a very, very different world. So perhaps it makes sense, just for the sake of this episode, to think twice, to consider a planet B, just in case. I know there's a lot to unpack, but let's take a moment to reflect. So on this episode, it's my great pleasure to have Dr. Mary Hagedorn as my esteemed guest. She's a distinguished researcher at the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute. She's known for her groundbreaking work in biodiversity preservation with coral reefs. And only very recently she and her team came up with a very provocative idea they turned into a paper which produced quite a bit of debate. And the idea of that paper is to create a backup copy of our biodiversity and transfer it to the moon as a safety net. And as you can imagine, the debate around this is just beginning. And as we will see throughout our conversation with Dr. Mary Hagedorn, it may be our only viable option if we want to make it through that, for the lack of a better word, technological and cultural filter that we're passing or not passing through at the moment. The challenges posed by climate change and habitat destruction have surpassed our current capacity to safeguard these species and our own species. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Mary Hagedorn to the Space Cafe podcast. Get ready for an enlightening discussion on the intersection of conservation, space exploration, and the future of life, just as we know it. Let's go. What's the state of corals in the ocean as we speak?
It's not good, and it's not improving. I think that's the bad part. I think corals are amazingly resilient. They can recover from all sorts of things like hurricanes and, tsunamis. And so they're very resilient, but climate change is not abating. And so it's getting worse and worse every year. And as an example, the Great Barrier Reef has suffered several back-to-back bleaching events in the last 6 years. And when you have those kinds of warming events in the ocean, which we call bleaching events, they stress the coral, they can kill the coral, and they can stop them from reproducing. So you are basically hurting, you're either killing the coral or you're damaging the future of the coral. And then if it comes the following year and the following year, oftentimes the corals cannot withstand that kind of stress.
I'm sorry, just a very basic question. Why are corals important? I mean, of course they're important because they're a species and they're part of our planet. So are we. So I shouldn't ask that question, but still, what is the effect of corals on the whole biosphere?
Right. So corals are under and it actually feeds into this whole concept of the lunar biorepositories. This is one of the categories that we're really interested in protecting are a group called ecological engineers. And corals are considered ecological engineers because they're animals, but they create habitat.
Hmm.
And they nurture over 1/4 of all marine life on Earth, and they protect our cities and our homes. They provide financial remuneration for our global economy, it's suggested to be about 10 billion per year in terms of tourism, fisheries, et cetera, et cetera. So they impact every aspect of our lives here on Earth, and they are critical to life on Earth because they also help. They don't directly produce oxygen, but they help in the whole sequence of oxygen production on Earth.
And they're a habitat for, I guess, a lot of marine life. So it's the home to a large part of marine life, I guess.
Correct. And so they're a nursery ground, as I said, for almost 1/4 of marine life.
Fantastic.
And many of those species are fishes that we eat.
Mm.
And so especially when you think of, sort of island states, island countries, island nations, sorry. And they're very dependent on the protein that comes off coral reefs. And so without that, you can imagine that hunger will increase in the years to come if we start to lose
Hmm.
significant portions of those reefs for those island nations.
Hmm. So how bad is the situation on a global scale? How old are corals, and what's happening, and when did things start to go south?
So that's a complex question, especially if you think of it geologically,
Mm.
because we've had several events on Earth geologically that have destroyed almost all of the species on the planet, right? And species persist, right? They keep coming
Mm.
back. And so there's no question in my mind that species will persist if we destroy many of the species on Earth. But in the past, humans have not been a part of the equation of those events. And this event in terms of climate change is very abrupt. And so species are having difficulty adapting and changing because it is going so fast. And so it's not clear what's going to happen, 100,000 years from now or 1,000,000 years from now. But it's very possible that in many of the listeners' lifetimes, that they will no longer have coral reefs per se. There'll probably still be coral in the oceans, but I could imagine in 50 years, maybe even 75 years, that there will not be much coral left in the
Mm.
ocean. And you look at places like the Caribbean, there is very little functional. I mean, there's corals left, but they're not very functional.
Mm.
And so, like when we had that really big warming event in Florida last year, the water got up to 101 degrees Fahrenheit. I forget what that is centigrade, probably close to 40 degrees
Absolutely. It's
centigrade.
mind-blowing.
Yeah.
Mind-blowing.
Yeah, and it was for a long time. And so one of the major bulwarks of the reef there is this species called Acropora palmata, commonly called elkhorn coral, and there are about 125 individual genotypes. We call them, corals can reproduce, they can drop an arm or they can fragment, and they can also reproduce sexually. And so
Mhm.
sometimes you have clones and sometimes you have sexually produced individuals, but of the sexually produced individuals, there was 125 unique ones left in Florida. After that event, there were only 25. And so you can imagine that if you were you were in the Caribbean 20 years ago, there'd have been perhaps tens of thousands of individuals, and so it's staggering what is happening. So, things are not good, and we aren't changing our appetite for fossil fuels fast enough. I know there's lots of people, myself included, who really, want to have rapid change, but it's such a difficult problem in terms of our society, and it's complex, and so that's what brings me into my job, really.
Mm.
In terms of what I do. Um, I try and cryopreserve coral species. We cryopreserve the sperm. We cryopreserve the larvae. We're trying to cryopreserve the actual small pieces of coral. And the whole goal there is to create this repository globally, we're going to create a global biorepository, not and include live fragments and frozen tissue. But the goal really is to give people time. We understand that it takes a lot of time to sometimes change society, and I think of the U.S. We used to smoke in the U.S. quite heavily in the 70s and 80s, perhaps throughout the 1900s. And it was almost in a short span of like 5 years, all of a sudden smoking
Exactly.
stopped, And so you can have
there's
these
hope.
societal shifts. Yeah, I hope. Yeah. And so you need to have a little bit of leeway to allow these societal changes to happen. But the pace of what's happening with climate change is going way faster than society is changing.
There's to me, it was a heartbreaking story. My wife and I, we're passionate scuba divers, and so we took our youngest daughter last year to the Mediterranean for a baby scuba diving experience, and we just wanted to show her what marine life looks like, what scuba diving is all about. But in the Mediterranean, the only colored thing you can still see is a yellow piece of maybe what you would consider a coral. But there's just, everything is gray. There's just one color. I don't know, you have to travel for quite a bit to find a piece that's still intact. And this is heartbreaking, because if I tell my 13-year-old daughter how things were a couple of years ago, 20 years ago, it's heartbreaking that she will maybe never experience that again. It's heartbreaking.
Yeah, I mean, it's I don't know if you ever saw the movie Soylent Green, but it reeks of that, where the oceans die and we're eating people. I hope that doesn't come to that, but it won't. Our oceans are vast, and there is a lot of resiliency in our species. And I think there are people out there that really do care and really do want to save species. And so, but I think that what's going to have to happen in the next 20 years is we're just going to have to dig really deep and help, and not just assume that nature is going to take care of itself. And you can hope that nature will take care of itself, but it's probably not going to happen. And so that's where we come in, in terms of all the sort of conservation biologists who want to do both ex situ and in situ conservation. And the idea that there's only one way to do conservation is very limiting. And it, because if you only have one way, and let's imagine you're saying, oh, we only do marine protected areas. If that doesn't work, which it's not working, I mean, it won't work in the long run. You need to have plan B. And so, you can imagine that it's really important to develop these technologies and develop these methods and collect, while there's still a lot of biodiversity and genetic diversity in the ocean, so that it can be replanted or can be reseeded into the ocean 100 years from now or 50 years from now. Maybe your daughter will be that person who does it.
Exactly. I think perhaps nature will take care of itself, but time speaks against us. That's the problem, because I think even if we extinct 99% of corals on the planet, they will come back, but it will just take 1 million years.
Yes.
And that's so this is what speaks against us as humans. Anyways, so you are in the business now. I wouldn't call you an activist, but maybe you were on the verge of becoming an activist, because you know what's at stake. That's the problem. So you're in the business of trying to make sure, as you mentioned, or as you said, buying time, that we have a backup plan. And a backup plan meaning that we have something in store that once things go south, we can reseed the planet. But how would we do that? That sounds like very much like taken out of a science fiction movie, because I mean, like the vastness of the oceans. How would you reseed something like this?
I don't know. That's, it's really part of the conservation and restoration, parlance. I think people are really now trying. Like there's a program in Florida, on the Florida Reef Tract, and the Florida Reef Tract is the third largest coral reef in the world. and it's being devastated by climate change and warming waters. And the Mission Iconic Reef is this program, and basically all they want to do is keep outplanting corals. They know they're going to die, so they're going to just keep growing them and putting them back out and growing them and putting them back out. And that's not a bad strategy at all, really. I mean, it seems a bit, it seems a bit hard, but the idea really is that, you keep the diversity, or you keep something on the reef so that if other corals want to settle in time, they will. And it still allows for fish, it still allows for fisheries, it still allows for tourism, all these sorts of things. And so you could imagine in the next, say, let's just think of it in the next 50 years, where we're really actively, changing reefs, outplanting, et cetera, et cetera. And, it might be that people pick, 10 reefs in the world, and they work on those that are strategic and, that have the right currents, that can spread, coral larvae around, around the oceans in their currents. And you pick those strategic places, and you go and you really actively work on those places. So I work on with a group. It's called the Coral Biobank Alliance, and it's a global group of professionals who are interested in bringing corals into captivity, who are interested in cryopreserving and also creating biorepositories for frozen tissue and genomics. And we're doing a really good job at this point. We've probably got about 250 species of the 1,000 that are in the ocean in captivity. Now, that doesn't mean we have a lot of genetic diversity. We have a lot of biodiversity, which means we have a lot of species. And it's what you really, really want to have is genetic diversity. And that's where cryopreservation can come into play, because we can hold vast numbers of individuals as sperm or as larvae in a frozen repository, while you keep 10 individuals from a population in aquaria. It's very expensive to keep them in aquaria, because you're really asking, a professional aquarium to hold them for 100 years or more, and because corals can live for 100, 200 years or more.
There's a similar concept, a similar backup plan for plant seeds in Norway, the global seed vault, Svalbard. Have you ever been?
It's again on my bucket list. No, I wanted to go, but they've sealed it now. You cannot go to Svalbard anymore. You can't go into the seed vault anymore. I actually had a trip planned, and then I found out. I talked to someone from CBS or something like that, and they said no, it's sealed now. You cannot go in. And I was grateful that it was sealed, because it had some rain inundation in 2017, which threatened the vault. And it's better that it's sealed now, and they have, they have pumps and things like that to help stop any future, rain inundation to the vault. But even there, where they're, in the Arctic, there's still climate change is changing our planet. And it was one of the reasons we couldn't, there's no place on Earth cold enough for a cryopreserved biorepository like Svalbard for animals and tropical plants that cannot be saved.
So there's a difference for plant seeds. It's cold enough, so that's okay. So Svalbard is okay. But if you want to,
-8.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
No. But if you want to do other species like animals, you need lower temperatures. That's the difference.
Yes.
Okay. So
almost 10 times lower. So there's no place on Earth. So Svalbard's at -18 degrees centigrade at the bottom of the mine there. It's an old mine. And so the plant seeds, they dry them, and then they can stay at that temperature for hundreds of years. It's a great way to store seeds. Many of the biorepositories on Earth store their seeds at that temperature. And but the difference is that Svalbard is a passive biorepository. It doesn't need people, and it doesn't need energy. It makes it a perfect backup plan for our really critical seeds here on Earth. But as you mentioned, some certain plants cannot be dried, such as many tropical plants, and animal cells cannot be dried. They have to be cryopreserved, and they need to be maintained in liquid nitrogen, which is at -196 degrees centigrade.
So that's 10 times, as you mentioned.
Yeah. So there's no place on Earth cold enough for that. And that's why we started thinking about, when we started thinking about, a biorepository that mirrored Svalbard, we started thinking about first the International Space
Hmm.
Station. But there's radiation. Over time, you would get a lot of radiation, and it would impact the cells. And then we started thinking about the moon, and there's still radiation on the moon. But if you dig down about 2 meters, you block most of the radiation. And the great thing is that on the southern part of the moon, there's these things called permanently shadowed regions, which are at 196
Wow.
degrees centigrade or less.
So
They're very cold.
that's liquid nitrogen temperature.
Hmm.
Fantastic.
Yes.
Fantastic. So is this, I mean, like, before we dive into that concept, it seems like we are already on an escape plan, because we know that we're doomed. And so we're running already to bring whatever is left, and we can save, and we're transferring it to the remotest places. Now we're thinking the moon. So are we doing it because we can do it technically, and we have matured enough to be able to do it technically? Or are we in a predicament that we know we have to do that now because doom is upon us?
I wouldn't. I personally, I look at it differently. I look at it with one of hope, that we are perhaps evolving culturally, where we understand that we need to sort of support and back up things that are most precious on Earth in any way that we can. I mean, we do things like that for art, for dinosaur bones, for whatever. We spend millions of dollars and put them in museums, and we take care of them. But the thing that is most important to life on Earth, we abuse. And so my hope is that we are learning that it's really critical that we maintain it, that we are in the process of culturally evolving so that we will learn to care for it better on Earth. But in that process, in that very difficult process of understanding the power and the horribleness of climate change, that we have this backup plan, and we technically have the ability to do it. Why not do it while we can?
And the benefit of the moon is it's a low maintenance solution. So it's kind of tricky to get there, but once you are there, there is no maintenance necessary, right?
Correct. I mean, ideally, we haven't done it yet. you know? So that is the plan. And so we're in the process right now. We just bid for a spot on the Griffin mission. It's a mission that's going up in 2025. And so potentially we will put our important cells in these radiation hardened boxes. And the idea is that these radiation hardened boxes, and what a radiation hardened box is, it means it stops a good part of the radiation that might enter the box, because you'll get radiation going from Earth to the moon, and then while you're being in transit to being in the biorepository, which we don't have a place for it yet. We don't know where that's going to be, but we want to make sure that whatever we place the cells in, that they can keep the cells safe until they get there. And so we're bidding for that, and we're going to test how much radiation the box well, there's no cells in the box. There will be no cells in the box. There'll be everything but the cells, because there's a thing called the Planetary Protection Act that doesn't. You really have to go through a lot of hoops if you want to bring biomaterial to another planet. And we won't do that. We'll do everything but that. But we're going to be measuring everything possible to make sure that we understand the radiation environment. And then we're going to test the cells here on Earth to make sure that they aren't damaged by that radiation environment. And that we also want to make sure that they stay cold. And we have a small cryo engine that we'll put on this mission if we get accepted. And so we'll have the first phase of understanding how these sort of the beginning of the biorepository might behave when it gets to the moon. And so, we are starting, and we're starting to understand, and we'll do a lot more testing, and we hope we might even get up to the International Space Station and test up there. And then it really then will be about, how do we get money to do these collections? How do we get on missions to, place the samples? Where do we place the samples? Actually, one of the most complex things is, I don't think technologically, it will be the governance of this biorepository. And when you think Svalbard is a really good example of governance, they did a great job with it. But as seed banks are now a war target.
Absolutely.
The Ukrainian seed bank was destroyed. And so, we want to make sure that if we go to this trouble for all mankind, that it is a neutral zone and that people will respect that it is neutral and that, the biodiversity of the earth is not threatened by our societal mores.
If I remember correct, you also lost one of your research banks, right? So you pretty much know what's at stake and what that means. Can you speak to that a little?
Yeah, no, it's, you always think, oh, the bank's fine. We're all good. We have liquid nitrogen. So I live in Hawaii, and Hawaii is basically a rock in the middle of the ocean, and it's 3,000 miles away from anything. So we don't have a lot of this, easy access to many things and like technicians for, scientific equipment and stuff like that. It takes them weeks to get there, because you have to plan it, and it just takes it's a lot. And we had this bank and it worked flawlessly for many years, and it started failing, and we knew it was failing, and we tried to get the part from the company so that we could fix the bank, and they wouldn't take our credit card, they wouldn't take a purchase order. They wanted a check from the Smithsonian, and there's Smithsonian just doesn't do checks.
Of course.
And in that interim, when they were arguing with us, it failed completely.
No.
And we lost everything that was in there. Fortunately, we had backed up some of the stuff at the USDA's animal germplasm biorepository in Fort Collins, but still, we're now in the process of putting, building back some of the things that we lost. But it really brought home to me how fragile, and actually at that same time, Oahu was out of liquid nitrogen, because we use a boat to bring liquid nitrogen to Oahu rather than making it here. And so I now have a liquid nitrogen maker in my lab. I have a new biorepository, but even so, I'm much more cautious. Every month we send things away now, because being in an area where things are fragile, supply chains can be fragile. Or, you can have these hiccups in getting parts. You don't want to be dependent on those sorts of things. You want to make sure that your bio material is going to be really safe.
So even if it sounds technically very challenging, maybe the moon is the best bet, because there is no Katrina moments. During Katrina, also a bunch of biobanks got destroyed. There's no check versus credit card issue when it comes to refueling your liquid nitrogen. So low maintenance, I think that was what you're looking for. Can we now dive into how all this, or now, a very blunt question. If you were charged, you, Mary Hagedorn, to collect samples from all species on the planet, how much volume would that take up to bring then to the moon? Is this, I don't know, can that be estimated?
I don't know the answer. I think one of the reasons we wrote the paper was really to get more global voices in this process, because we're just, a bunch of Americans doing this during COVID, right? And we understood that we had a very limited, group, and that we wanted to write this and get more international voices to sort of weigh in on this. So that's really the very first thing. You really want to have more voices to guide this process, especially in governance. What functionality do we need to maintain here on Earth? What are the key species that we need to maintain and send up? So I think you need to think of it strategically. And so one of the groups that I think that's really important is to take ancestral animals for our agriculture. So maybe wild pigs and wild boars or whatever, might be an ancestral animal to many of the organisms that we have, in agriculture today. And like certainly all the pollinators, those are critical to life on Earth. And as I said, ecological engineers, coral reefs would probably be one of them, but then there'll be others as well. So I think having the international community weigh in on strategically planning this as to what goes up, what is collected first.
It's like Noah's Ark.
In a way, it's a little it's a little overused, but I think that because Noah only took 2, we only took more than 2, and that's a critical element. Like, is there enough genetic diversity left in this species? You don't want to take black-footed ferrets. Sorry to the black-footed ferret people. There's only 20, of them or so left, and no, there's more than that. But their genetic diversity is not wide.
So Noah's Ark wouldn't have worked because the diversity wouldn't have worked. So all the work would have been in vain, right?
Don't say, oh my gosh, let us not get into a religious argument
Yes.
about that. But biologically, Noah probably was good, but not great.
Yeah. So, Mary, technically, how would that work now? So, where would you get those samples from? So, if we go back to the corals, so how would you sample, and then how? I mean, like, let's trace that path to the moon.
So we're actually in the process of trying to do that now for the corals because we know so much about it, and it's perhaps one of the more urgent, ecosystems on Earth to think about. And so, we're engaged with globally doing, sort of analysis to see where, some of the threats and opportunities might lie for coral reefs. And to really start thinking about it strategically, my guess is that we will start in the Caribbean, but I don't know that for sure. We're dealing with, again, an international group that's trying to help decide. And, you could imagine that there may be 4, there may be 5, there may be 8 locations that we would have to go to. It's complicated by international permitting. And so there's this process called the Nagoya Protocol, and that prevents you going into a country and taking any genetic material from that country because it's to stop biopiracy, which of course is a bad thing. But it impacts this ability to, say, go to someplace like Belize or Mexico and get a simple permit to take out 20 individuals of a particular species. So a lot of this will be complicated by the permitting and what we actually can get. But the idea, we're actually going to start here in Hawaii because we've already gotten those permits. We've already gotten agreements for many groups, and we're going to use Hawaii as a way to test out the whole entire process. And so in Kaneohe Bay, where I live, we would go out on a boat, and we'd first decide on the species we're going after. Excuse me. And then we would go down and we take an image of that colony. We would tag it physically. We would GPS tag it. We would take a fragment or 2 and we would put it in live culture. So the Department of Aquatic Resources has agreed to take some of this material. And we would then take small samples for genomics, for the microbiome, for a voucher sample that would go into a museum so we know what species we're dealing with. And if we had the ability to cryopreserve the fragments, we would cryopreserve. And then we'd bring fragments in later for sperm and larval cryopreservation. They mostly do that during the summer. We would do this in the winter. So that's how we would do it for one species. But the thing that if we were going to do coral and send it up to the moon, we would send either sperm or larvae. And so unless we can do fragments, we're still in the process of trying to learn how to do that. But we have these tiny little bags, and they kind of excuse me, they kind of function like, if you think of a small ketchup packet, a mustard
Mm-hmm.
packet. They're going to be about that small. And for most of the species, we will use skin, and from the skin, we can take these cells called fibroblast cells. And so for most species, we know how to cryopreserve
Mm-hmm.
fibroblast cells. We do not know how to cryopreserve most sperm or even larvae or embryos of most species. Humans are rare. There was just so much money put into humans that
Interesting.
we could cryopreserve the sperm and the embryos and the eggs of human, but for wildlife, that's just
So
not
you
the
just
case.
can't take, I don't know, wildlife sperm from a lion, for example, and just freeze it and it works. So it doesn't work.
Oh,
Interesting.
no.
Huh.
I mean, maybe for lions, there's some, but for most species, there's not. I mean, I would say, yeah, there's just not that well known for a lot of species. So fibroblast cells are these incredible cells that can be transformed into stem
Mm-hmm.
cells, and those stem cells can then be used for cloning.
Mm-hmm.
And so, we may not know how to clone every single species on Earth today. I'm sure we don't, but 20 years from now we may, 30 years from now we may. And so we have a pathway for most species. We certainly have a pathway for coral, and insects. And there are enough people who are experts in many of these areas that basically we will just create partnerships around the world, and those partners will do it. It won't be Johnny Appleseed, me going out collecting, the opposite of Johnny Appleseed, actually. I think there are lots of very dedicated and very good people who know how to collect. And one of the authors on the paper is the head of an organization in the U.S. called NEON, which stands for the National Environmental Observatory Network. And they're collecting across the U.S. Every year in all 50 states. And so they have this huge army of people who know how to collect, and also these agreements with European and other nations for collecting. So we have the beginnings of the army, in terms of the national, it's called NEON, in terms of NEON. So we have a beginning. And really, I think what will happen initially is that we'll send up a few species as, sort of diplomats to the moon and see how it goes, see how well it goes. And then we don't have to have the money to go to the moon. We don't have to have the missions lined up or anything like that. There's enough cold chain storage. Amazon has huge cold chain storage here in the United States, where we could start to cryopreserve and store here in the U.S. and Europe, all over the world. So
why Amazon? Why are they doing that?
One of the biggest companies in the world, yeah.
Yeah.
In terms of how they want to keep things cold, who knows? I mean, there's a
like
lot
for
of
the server farmers, I guess.
Perhaps, I don't know.
Okay. Fantastic. Really interesting. I'm just wondering, now you have those samples, and is the army big enough of collectors, or could you citizen science that, or is that too complex?
Absolutely. No, absolutely. I think they could, because you could imagine, because we're collecting skin cells. I mean, if you have skin cancer, they don't come out, usually that you don't necessarily, especially if you're in remote areas, you don't necessarily have to go in. If you suspect you have something wrong with your skin, they'll send you a tiny little kit where you take a punch, and you take a tiny punch of your skin, you stick it in the vial, and you send it in. And that's basically what we would do. And then we'd extract the fibroblast cells from there. So there, citizen scientists definitely could do it. It's making sure that the skin is clean, or like if you were doing something that was furry, like a wolf or something like that, you'd have to, clean that skin up. And when I did the fit, I made some samples already. I used fish fins, and I had to really clean it first with alcohol and stick it in an antibiotics rinse for about 30 minutes. So, but you can imagine that there'd be kits for this, and that sophisticated citizen science can do it. I mean, there's people who are like birders or professionals, amateur astronomers, those sorts of people are just amazing in what they know and what they can do. And, we would certainly want to mobilize those really sophisticated.
There's a fantastic insect collection initiative going on amongst citizen science. I don't know if that's only Europe or globally, but this is fascinating. I mean, like, there's really a lot of potential possible through dedicated and enthusiastic and inspired lay scientists.
Absolutely. It's going to be the management of these samples and, making sure everything is put into a database so we know what's there, and making sure that, the biggest problem really is that many museums want to have voucher samples. And you can imagine, like, say you had a big animal like a mountain lion or something like that. You're not going to, if you're a hunter or something like that, you can use a dart and take a sample. So that you can't take a voucher sample of the mountain lion. You would take a high resolution image and then you would take your sample. So I think there's ways of doing it, but we do want to make sure that we are getting the genomics. We want to make sure we do have some understanding of what that animal was, not just the skin, because you can make mistakes. Mistakes can be made. And we want to make sure all of this goes into a database so that we know what's there, and what makes sense to send to the moon.
Back in the very old days in Alexandria, there is this myth that incoming ships were forced to hand over any kind of books they were bringing during their stay.
Interesting.
And those books during their stay were copied and then handed back to the owners on the ships, so that all the knowledge was copied and transferred into Alexandria. So it could also be interesting now to see, or to maybe see that as an inspiration for what we're talking about.
I got to ask this question. What if life on Earth dies and then it re-evolves and we have this biorepository in the moon? They're going to think that life arose on the moon. And I was like, oh my gosh. And I think one of the things that some people have asked is, could we have a biorepository that included, all the knowledge of Earth? And that's certainly something that could be, put in the biorepository as well.
We had a very interesting person on the show called Barbara Belvisi from Interstellar Labs from France. And what she does is she builds grow pods for plants, plant life for interstellar use. And so, amongst other things, she said that her mission, her life's mission is to help biodiversity, or life itself, become interplanetary. So, and that's a big thing to say, but in fact, this is also something that you are doing with that idea to bring biodiversity or life in general to a different extraterrestrial place. So maybe it's a philosophical concept, but the question is, should we do something like this?
I don't know if we should or we shouldn't. I think it's going to happen, actually. I don't think anyone's going to consult all of us, because I think people are just amazingly curious, and exploration is in our genes. And I think, these trips to Mars will happen at some point. We will live on the moon, or we will work and live on the moon. And I think one of the things, that, we can't, obviously, the moon has no atmosphere, and, they will have to grow things on the moon, for food. There will have to be grow houses. They'll have to be underground. And so, the idea that, missions to wherever, will happen. And if people are not, and people are talking about it, but I don't know if it will actually ever happen. They want to put people into hibernation. They want to cryopreserve them. They want to do all sorts of things for these long trips, right? So, but let's just think of Mars, right? Mars has a weak atmosphere. It's a planet that's lost its atmosphere, and it's, you can imagine that, I think The Martian really did a good job. The movie The Martian did a really good job of really trying to explain some of the challenges that people would face when they when they go there. But I do think that people are going to go there. I think they are going to want to terraform Mars. When you think about terraformation, you're really talking about some of the really critical microbes that live on Earth, that live in the soil, that break down soil, that create oxygen, that do a lot of really critical that have critical functions on Earth. You're talking about pollinators. You're talking about all sorts of things like that. And so, I will be long gone probably by the time those things start. But the bank, this biorepository, it's meant for all mankind, really. And depending on what we decide as a species or whatever, because it's not going to be, hopefully, will be owned by any particular country or group. And so, I imagine that there will be the capacity to allow some of these missions to take things for terraformation and space exploration.
Who do you think can finance something like this? Is this a nation state, a United Nations effort, or is it a philanthropic effort by a super rich person?
I think it's a bit like a natural history museum. A city, a state, whatever, says, oh, we really want one, and they get a big building and they get some people and they slowly start filling it. And I actually think it's going to happen over time, slowly over time. We're not going to just say, oh, let's just collect everything in the next year and do this and send it all up. I think that would be foolish because we don't know enough about how things will survive and how things will work there. I mean, some of the things that are, you think, oh yeah, let's just put it on the moon. But working at liquid nitrogen temperatures, you cannot really, And so I am actually thinking about putting on some oceanographers on our panel, because oceanographers have to work in very deep places on Earth where they never see what they're doing, really. They just drop their packages or their instruments down and they have ways of retrieving it, right? And that's basically what we may have to do in these places, because like if you use a rover or a robot, however you think of it, they only have 6 hours of lifetime at liquid nitrogen temperatures. And because the battery just stops functioning. Think of cars in very cold places. You can't, after -50, it's really hard to start a car, right? So a rover is going to have a similar difficulty. How do you dig at liquid nitrogen temperatures? Do you drop a bomb and make a hole? I don't. Some of these are things we just haven't figured out. And the other thing is that I was talking to someone who said, if you take a rover and you put it into a permanently shadowed space, it's going to be warm when it leaves the surface or the rim of that. It's a canyon, and it's going to leave a vapor trail as it cools down, going to liquid nitrogen temperatures. So there's lots to consider. There's certainly a way of doing it, and one very simple way is to have capsules that are just made for this, right? And but radiation then will become an issue. You could land a capsule, in an unmanned capsule in a permanently shadowed space, area, and then you could potentially somehow try and figure out. There's people who are trying to figure out how to make cement on the moon. So there's the people are thinking about building. They're thinking about how that happens. The next Artemis rover that's going up is going to have a digging arm on it, so there's definitely, people are thinking about how do we do these things? We don't know just yet. So I think there's some really interesting technical issues and concepts. I mean, in the Sea of Tranquility, where the first Apollo astronauts landed, they just found this massive cave. It's just gigantic, and so it's unlikely that in the in the poles they'll have those caves, because there wasn't volcanic action in those areas. But who knows? What we would find in those areas. It's still very much unknown. We don't know that much about what they actually look like, those permanently shadowed areas.
Would you go on a scouting mission?
I applied to NASA right after graduate school. I did, yeah.
You did?
Many of the people on my group are like wannabe astronauts.
So you'd be ready to
I would go in a
ready
heartbeat.
to go.
Yeah, seeing
So who's
seeing seeing
yeah,
seeing
now
the
go ahead.
Earth from space, I think, has got to be one of the biggest thrills, of the of people who do have that opportunity to get into space. Obviously, it's not easy to be, on the moon or whatever the case may be, and I will probably never make it to the moon, but still, I'm the fact that the group that I'm with are just like all these science nerds from, MIT and Harvard. And, we love talking about this because it really stretches our mind and our creativity. It is really, really a lot of fun.
But this is what it's all about. I mean, like to inspire, to have a crazy project on the horizon and to nerd out and to do what humans do best,
Yep.
and that is to be creative.
Absolutely. And, I think the whole idea hopefully is that, we'll inspire, a generation that will really take this up, and really want to, collect, really want to make this so it is something that is, a century of work protecting Earth.
Uh, a technical question. So would the regolith on the moon or the Mars soil, would that be sort of a basis for future farming on those places? So, or could you do something with it, or would there need to be a major transformation, or would we need to bring our own soil in order to grow something on the moon?
I don't know honestly the answer to that. I'm not a specialist in that, but certainly, um, I just don't know. I don't know how. Supposedly, the moon, theoretically, the moon was cast off from the Earth. So you could imagine. But
Yeah,
yeah, I mean,
should be
and
the
and
same.
that's really one of the questions. And I think some of the people who really want to study, astrobiology and the origins of the moon
Mm.
and other solar planets, don't want people to go there because they really don't want it to be tampered with. Because if once you start getting all sorts of people and plant, bacteria and things like that, it becomes very difficult to understand the evolution, especially for, some of the permanently shadowed areas. They're supposed to have water in them, or they have water in them. They know it has water in them. And, the water is valued because it's water, but also it's fuel. But if it's water that originally came from Earth, then you should be able to tell that it has its origins from Earth. But if it's water from a different process, then it will look different. But once you start tampering and putting, a biorepository in the middle of, things you want to study, I think it gets a little bit difficult. But I mean, you certainly could
Yeah.
have places that are off limits where you don't ever touch them, and they're just used for scientific study. I don't think the whole moon has to be off limits.
Any reactions yet to your
You
crazy
know,
project?
when I
Like political
When I
decision
first
maker
started
reactions?
thinking about this, really, my institution was not in favor of it at all. They said, "Stop working on it. This is great. Don't do this." And of course, I just kept thinking about it. And then, of course, the opportunity came up in COVID when I had a lot of colleagues who were interested. But no, not. I mean, I think I've actually been more surprised by how many people think it's a good idea now. And I think we've gone through a change, right? We've gone from, say 2016, 2015, where people are like, no, what? That's just crazy.
Yeah.
We're very different now. And it speaks to, I think, our evolution as a species, cultural evolution, not species, our cultural evolution, that we are changing. We're thinking more broadly. We're thinking about ways to ensure our ecosystems, our survival on this planet. But I also, I think it's more fundamental than that. I got a couple emails, one in particular, from a colleague in Israel. And she said she saw the article in the newspaper, and she was very surprised to see that I was doing this. But she said it gave her such hope in the middle of a war that seemed ceaseless and untenable to her as she, sat there on the edge of Gaza, and she said it really helped her. And I've gotten other emails from people that have said, societally, it seems like we've taken so many wrong turns globally. in terms of democracy or how human rights, however you want to think about it. And this really gave them hope that we were starting to think more about what we can do for the planet, what we can do for each other, how we can support and save each other.
I think it's a massive
and
peace
I guess
project.
I never expected that. It really was just this, sort of nerdy idea I never had. I never really intended it
Sure.
to be a peace project. But if it is and people embrace it, I'm all for it.
So how much
do it?
time do you need
Yeah.
to do it?
It's a decades long project. So it's the sort of thing where, it's a relay race. I'll pass the baton, and then someone else will take it up.
Mm.
I think if we could work out some of the technical details, like we know we can get these, whenever we're going to send up a box, and we have a place, and we test it on the ISS by 2030. Then we can start to collect here on Earth and work out the governance and work out, where we're going to go and how we're going to, store it. That may take 10 years. So maybe by 2040, we'll have our first. We will have actually. I'm really hoping that the company that's running this next mission will take our our project. But there's other opportunities. The Artemis project there's a call for proposals for the Artemis 3 project, and we could also propose for that. And that is another opportunity. So I think at some point in the next, say 5 years, we'll work on the technical aspects of getting this to work. And then after that, it's really just a question of the governance. Where is it going to go? How are we going to store them? And that could take a while. But we can be collecting during that time. So I would imagine the 2030s might be a period of collection where we're holding things on Earth. We're making decisions globally as a people, and we are collecting all over the Earth, and we are making sure that we've covered a lot of things, and then it's really a question of how we will get it up there. I mean, it could possibly be that we have our own, a series of missions that are just for this. And you can think of them as like, natural history pods, and if they're properly, insulated, maybe we don't have to dig them down. Maybe we can just leave them, in a capsule that sits in a permanently shrouded space. I don't know.
It's a troubling thought for myself. When you mentioned 2040, it's a troubling thought that I immediately thought, if we make it through 2040. So I mean, like, what time is it that we're living in? Isn't that crazy? To have such a thought.
Here in the U.S., if you talked to me 8 weeks ago, I might have been of that same mindset. But I'm seeing a transformation politically. Whether that transformation will bring us through and won't go into autocracy.
Yes.
Is really an important thing, and but many countries are going into autocracy, and it is just the pendulum shifting, as it did in the 30s to the 1930s, and we went through a really black and horrible time.
Mary, let's talk something more jolly. You already mentioned that in a heartbeat you would go to the moon, or wherever you were asked to go with your samples. We have a fun tradition here on the Space Cafe podcast, and that is to ask our guests for that interplanetary or potentially wherever you're going journey into space. It's going to be after a couple of days and after the first excitement has worn off. It's going to be a boring journey because there's quite a bit of traveling going on. So I'm asking you, what's the one piece of music you wouldn't want to miss? What's the one tune you would want to bring on that journey? Because we have a playlist for that on Spotify. It's a playlist for the aspiring space traveler.
Okay, my
What's your
contribution
contribution?
is Miles Davis, Kind of Blue.
Good. It's not taken. Great. Fantastic. It's a kind of blue, fantastic. The pale blue dot, kind of blue, fantastic. And one more. This is the show is called the Space Cafe Podcast. It's something like a coffee place, and in coffee places, you now and then have an espresso to energize yourself when you're tired. Now, why don't you share an espresso for the mind with me, with the audiences? Something that you think could be a shot of inspiration, and you can pick whatever kind of topic you want to pick.
You know, I have to say it's the Olympics right now. You know, it is one of the few things on Earth where we still come all together, and it is the best of our young people, and we hope the best for them, and they get along generally very well. It's a very peaceful time, especially in Paris right now. It's just amazing to see, and for me, it always makes me cry because of that inspiration. I mean, it's just the most extraordinary feat. You know, I mean, these people are the most beautiful, the most, you know, sort of physically fit people on Earth, and we need to have that same sort of thing for our science nerds as well, where we bring the best of the best together in a science Olympics, where we think of some of the greatest things, you know, some of the greatest strategies and ways to help mankind. It would be a really great thing to have as well.
Fantastic. Mary, do you need help still with your Lunar repository project? So if our listeners now are super inspired, what do you want them to do? Who are you looking for?
We are looking for ideas from anyone, honestly. We want inspiration. We want ideas. We have no funds. We've done this all in a wish and a prayer. So, you know, it's really, I think, the more it becomes a sort of mainstream social idea, that it is important to support our biodiversity. It is one of the most critical things that we have on our planet, and it is precious. The more that idea becomes fundamental to our thinking as human beings, the more quickly we will be able to overcome climate change.
Fantastic. Mary Hagedorn, it's a privilege.
My pleasure.
Really,
Thank
it's been
you
a privilege to talk with you about such an important topic. It's not an everyday topic.
My complete pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So, my friends, as we wrap our conversation with Dr. Hagedorn, I want to leave you with a challenge. One challenge that got inspired by her espresso for the mind idea. And when Mary mentioned the Olympics as a uniting momentum for the world. And so when she proposed the Science Olympics, I figured what if this is what the world needs right now? And let's take it even further. This isn't just food for thought. It's a call to action. Let's imagine this to be a call to action for you and for me and for everyone listening right now. As we are at the critical point with climate change, biodiversity, loss, and the challenge of becoming an interplanetary species at the same time, we can't wait for someone else to find answers. The time to act is right now. So here's our challenge to you. How can we make science engaging and captivating like never before, and make it meaningful, and make it just like the Olympic spirit, the spirit of the Olympic Games? What can we do? And I know there's lots of bright minds listening right now. So let's put our heads and minds together as to how we could achieve something like this. We need rock stars for science. Just like, I'm not telling you anything new, but Brian May, the guitar player of Queen, he is an esteemed, distinguished, and very respected astronomer. So, rock stars for space, where are they? Let's dig them up. Let's bring them to the stage, and let's create the greatest festival on Earth for science, because science is full of rock stars. So, thank you, my friends. Thank you for listening to my ramblings, for being part of the Space Cafe podcast. Now let's get to work and let's make science the next global spectacle. Until next time, stay curious, my friends, and remember, the future of our planet and our species depends on what we do together, not alone, what we do as a team. You and I, and everyone listening, and everyone we know right now. Bye-bye.